Hello again, everyone. This is Travis Cuter from Veeam Software. We'd like to welcome you to today's webinar featuring ESG and Hewlett Packard Enterprise. ESG's Jason Buffington, the principal analyst for data protection, will be talking to Patrick about the industry trends driving the need for more data protection. We want to thank you for joining today. Before we get started, I'd like to run through just a few housekeeping items. First of all, everyone will be in mute mode, and you will be unable to unmute yourself for questions at this time. Question and answers will begin at the end of the webinar, so please make note of that. And slides will be made available as well as a recording delivered after the session in a separate email. So with that, I would like to turn the webinar now over to Jason Buffington from ESG. Jason?
Thanks, Travis. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Jason Buffington. I'm the principal analyst at ESG covering data protection. Joining me today is my very good friend, Patrick Osborne from HPE. Patrick, say hi.
Thanks, Jason. Hello to everyone out there, and thanks for joining the webinar. Really looking forward to talking about some of these very important subjects today.
So, Patrick, I think between the two of us, we probably have close to 50 years, give or take, of storage and data protection depth. So it's going to be fun. So Veeam invited us really without a whole lot of rules or chaperoning to kind of talk about what are we seeing in the market between ESG as an analyst firm and, of course, HPE. Of course, you've seen some of the largest enterprises in the world. So here's the idea what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about 4 IT trends that you should be planning for. Certainly first, production optimization via flash, right? Nothing gets better until production gets better, and certainly in storage, flash is part of that recipe. Then I'm going to pile back on with that and talk about, whenever you modernize production, you have to modernize protection, right? So that those cannot come separately. You will either do it reactively or you will do it proactively, but I promise you will modernize both. Then we're going to talk about how to get more out of your data protection infrastructure. The idea of having all of these copies and all of this stuff just waiting for something bad to happen isn't satisfactory for most environments today. And then lastly, plan for hybrid everywhere. And hybrid is an overused term, so I'll come back to what we mean by that when we do it. And along the way, being that Veeam was nice enough to set this call for today, Patrick, I'm hoping you'll weigh in on why did HPE, or what is the partnership like with Veeam, and then we'll have questions. Please feel free to use the Q&A tab within the GoToMeeting event, and then we will answer questions at the end of the event. So let's talk about modernization to start with. And when it comes to data center modernization, there's a couple things that I think are interesting to kind of draw out. Certainly, first and foremost, when you look at, okay, so what's driving data center modernization? Virtualization and just changing the way that servers are deployed, provisioned, and managed is certainly a big part of that. As I mentioned earlier, anytime that you modernize production, you have to modernize protection. So it should not be surprising to most folks that backup is actually the number 2 in this stack as far as 2017 data center modernization spending trends. This data, by the way, comes out of an ESG report where basically every year we ask folks, right in November, December timeframe, what do you actually have budgeted for next year? No buzzwords, no jargon, just what's in the budget. And you can see Vert comes in first, backup comes in second. And then you can start to see in here, okay, so we look at some of the other highlighted ones around consolidation, around use of flash. Patrick, I know you're going to talk about that in a second. Conversion infrastructure, data center, private cloud, all of that is around optimizing and modernizing the production infrastructure itself, and yet backup comes in number 2 on that, again, because when you modernize one, you modernize the other. So let's start with, why is it that production optimization starts with flash? And Patrick, I'm going to click to you, and I'm going to see if I can just give you control of the mouse so that you have control of your own destiny.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jason. So a couple of trends that we're seeing, certainly in the storage industry, is I think we've had some stats that we've quoted before around anywhere between 50 and 75% of the customers that we're engaging with are making the all-flash data center a reality over the next 2 to 4 years. With that comes a number of implications. There's a giant cutover here in media from spinning disk to flash, and there's certainly a lot of benefits from that. And what we see here is, Jason, I don't know if you can click through. I'm not.
I'll take it back. No problem.
All right, thanks. Great. So a couple of the areas that that customers are exploring are across multiple fronts here. So essentially, what you've seen in the beginning was a need for speed from a flash perspective. So it definitely increases your performance on a number of different scale-up arrays and certainly scale-out arrays. The economics of flash have definitely hit a tipping point where it's no longer feasible to be buying spinning disk as your primary storage, just even from a cost perspective. That doesn't necessarily equate to nearline and capacity-oriented workloads, but certainly for primary performance and IOPS-driven, we've hit certainly a tipping point from a pricing standpoint that will push people to flash, given the fact that we've got 16 terabyte media out there and moving to 32 and 64 in the near future. And then from a scale perspective, it's no longer a niche workload that is going to be applied from a performance perspective for flash. We see flash being deployed at scale with arrays now that support thousands of flash drives, and certainly some of the newer scale-out architectures that are server-based with things like low latency fabrics connecting those systems and scale-out architectures are going to give some new possibilities with flash. So it's definitely delivering on its promises. Jason, if you can move to the next slide, please.
How's that?
Thanks. So when customers transition to flash or are making this transition today, one of the areas is that even though that we're able to increase the performance of these systems on a tenfold basis, an order of magnitude, we have certainly enterprise class data services available now, and the cost is there. It definitely does introduce a number of issues around data protection and availability. So 3 out of 4 organizations that we talk to recognize that they have a protection gap as they are transitioning on their primary storage platforms. They admit that digital transformation, and whether that's regular applications being applied to flash or for some of the new architectures, they see that they're being held back by unplanned downtime, and you can even see this with operationalizing things like big data and Hadoop type of architectures that don't have a great backup and availability built-in schema. And then overall it's a pretty big exposure to the business. And so Jason, next slide please.
Actually, I want to pile on for this one just because this actually is ESG data that was provided along the way. So let's unpack that idea of that protection gap for just a second. So when ESG went out and asked about 1,000 enterprises worldwide, 24 countries, and basically said, and all of them with 1,000 users are up, and basically what they said was, we cannot afford the amount of data loss between between our data protection solution, what the RPO and RTO can give us, versus what the business is expecting, right? And so that protection gap and that availability gap are basically say 3 out of 4 organizations say we cannot recover fast enough, we cannot recover data to the satisfaction of the business unit. Interestingly enough, by the way, and then we asked them, okay, so what's that doing for you? 2 out of 3 orgs then said, okay, well, because we don't have confidence, because our users have dissat, digital transformation, virtualization, modernization, cloud adoption, all of those kinds of trends get held up along the way. So you want to talk about the importance of modernization along the way. Modernization is often being held back due to unsatisfactory protection or unsatisfactory availability type outcomes. So just had to pile on to that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, so if you move to the next slide, what you'll see is that these trends are moving at a record pace. So as customers start to introduce some of these digital transformation projects, we had sort of this wave one of flash was, adding just specific SSDs. You saw this with technologies like Fusion IO and Violin memory. You're going to apply a specific performance envelope to a specific application performance problem. Wave two sort of was when SSDs and capacities through whether it was a lower price in the media or some of the data compaction techniques like dedupe and compression, basically hit an economic price point which would preclude you from buying anything but flash for new primary storage projects. And right now is what we are is in this wave three, it's the default for critical apps, but to be able to do this, you need a set of data services and capabilities around data protection and HA and high availability that come with these platforms to make this sort of the new normal for your data center. But what we're also seeing is from a risk perspective. So Jason, if you move to the next slide, what these things are introducing though as we move to flash is there's a number of artifacts that get introduced because of these new architectures. So number one is that from a performance perspective, we're seeing shrinking to zero backup windows. These workloads are always on, and there's no dedicated backup windows, and often cases there's not a lot of dedicated backup teams to be supporting this infrastructure. Another thing we see is that because of the economics in the performance envelope, the physical infrastructure is supporting an order of magnitude larger number of workloads. So you have a much higher host fan out. Because of virtualization, you have a higher application density, density packing ratio for a physical asset. So your increase of risk is definitely non-linear to the actual physical footprint that you have on the data center floor. And we've seen that where customers are putting a ton of applications and a ton of workloads on one flash array. And if you have some sort of a failure, it definitely impacts you more so than older architectures. And then one of the other requirements we're seeing is more of a vertically oriented approach to data protection, where everything is being designed for the app. So for example, if you're a VMware admin, you want to do all of your data protection capabilities within vCenter, everything from snaps and replication to backup, and having some great plugins that not only manage your primary storage, but the networking, your secondary storage, as well as your backup and long-term archiving, all done from within your application window. So those are some of the things that we're seeing affecting data protection from a flash perspective. So Jason, I think you have the next slide.
Yeah, so then let's build from that. So so if flash is the catalyst that's modernizing so many different parts of the production infrastructure, then as we talked about earlier, when you modernize production, you have to modernize protection. So let's look at how those kind of come together. If you recall the first slide that I shared with data, we talked about how in data center priorities from a modernization perspective, virtualization and data protection are adjacent to each other. Now, I think what's interesting is we asked folks, what's the relationship between your server virtualization and your data protection environment? And honestly, the blue and the yellow are kind of both two sides of the same coin, and yet they're complementary to each other. About half of organizations, 48%, said we significantly accelerated our virtualization deployment and strategy because of better backup, right? So because you could do more with it, because VMs are easier to protect and recover, you were able to accelerate your virtualization. That's the proactive side of this deal. The reactive side is equally interesting, that yellow wedge, lower left. The difficulty of backing up VMs, and I'm going to put in parentheses there because of archaic or legacy methods, unparent, actually slowed down our virtualization deployment strategy, right? So think about this. You drop in these brand new shiny ProLiant servers or a virtual start ecosystem. You've got all the metal there. And you guys just bought SimpliVity too, so we should throw that into the mix as well. So you've got this shiny converged or hyper-converged infrastructure, and you try putting legacy backup solutions on that, and all of a sudden what happens is that shiny new infrastructure is now onto its knees because that's not the way that you back up VMs. And if you do it that way, you will hinder that shiny production environment. So it's interesting that collectively, what we got, 68%. So 2 out of 3 organizations see a direct line between having a modern approach for data protection and being able to enable or accelerate virtualization as a deployment method, which of course then transforms itself into digital transformation as a business enabling scenario as well. I'm going to skip through a little bit of the data just because I want to make sure that we have time for more of the conversation. But I did find interesting, looking at virtualization and protection, we found that there really wasn't much difference anymore between a modern approach for backing up physical servers and a modern approach for virtual machines, as long as you're using contemporary technology for each. And certainly, I think our hosts would have something to say about that. But let's not give Travis much time on the call today. So in this case,
I think one thing to point out though, Jason, is that you're still getting a high failure rate in some of these areas, and we see that too from the data that we get from our customers. The backup jobs are running longer because there's either the number of apps that you're trying to back up is increasing, or the amount of actual aggregate data that you're pushing through the pipe. And then the SLAs around RTO and RPO are actually getting more aggressive. So you've got variables going in the wrong direction on both sides.
Absolutely. Yeah, 2017, and yet still 3 out of 10 backup jobs take too long, and 1 out of 3 recoveries don't meet their SLAs in today. Right? I mean, that is still that might actually be as low as I've seen it in the last couple of years, and Patrick, I have had that part of the conversation before. So let's talk about what is it that IT folks are trying to do to kind of fix part of that. Now, we asked folks from an implementer lens. So I think of this as kind of head and heart. The heart is that IT implementer, that probably the folks who are on the call today, that are going, I need to know what to fix, right? I got to believe in what I'm doing, versus the head, which is that executive that says it's got to make, operational and economic sense along the way. So we asked folks on those 2 different lenses, what are you trying to work with? And here's some of the things we found out. Top 10 challenges from an implementation perspective. Certainly cost is king, right? So everybody is trying to get more value out of their data protection infrastructure, reducing costs along the way. You can see that blue is any of the challenges that apply, yellow meaning the gold one, meaning the primary challenge when you only pick one, and yes, cost trumps both lists. Not any real surprise here. Protecting that virtual environment is the number 2, right behind cost. It's the next most squeaky wheel. But I want to draw your eye, and Patrick, I want to point you to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th on this, and then we're going to look at the implementer, the executive lens on the next slide, and then let's talk about it for a second. 3, 4, and 5, I just want to improve reliability, right? That comes back to getting those SLAs down that we talked about earlier. Number 4, I want to reduce my backup time. That comes down to shrinking the backup windows we talked about earlier. Pat, you mentioned that. And then number 5 in the list, too many copies. And we're going to talk about that a little later in the call as well. But I think it's interesting that, yes, cost matters. Virtualization, biggest challenge in the data center. And then after that, it really comes down to qualitative and operational considerations. Reliability, speed, efficiency, right? And the reason I think that's so important, let me take us to the leadership side of this conversation, and then we can kind of nerd out on it for a minute. If you ask the other side of the coin, if you ask the execs, what are you looking for out of the deal? Take a look at what the execs are looking for. I need to increase the speed and agility of recovery. I need to increase the reliability of backups recoveries. I need to increase the speed and frequency of backups. And oh, by the way, and then storage cost comes in the number 4 slot. And then you can see there's kind of a waterfall. It rolls down. What I think is really interesting about this is that the last several years the ESG has asked these 2 questions. Typically, they're not that aligned, right? Typically, the execs have always wanted the same thing. The execs have always said, I just need it to run better. I need it to run cheaper. I need to be able to have confidence in it. Meanwhile, the implementers have, for the last several years, been like, what's squeaky? What do people complain about? I guess I got to go fix that. And so I love the fact in 2017, at least now folks are aligned, right? They've figured out that it's not about squeaky widgets. It's about, can I do it cheaper? Can I have more reliability? Can I be faster? Can I have more agility along the way? Patrick, you talk to as many customers, if not more than I do. What are you hearing from that?
So a couple things. Definitely I hear a desire to do things differently in terms of the speed and the reliability of backups. So definitely doing things like offloading a number of these operations at the storage layer, where some of these architectures can do this very well from an efficiency and certainly a speed area, as opposed to sort of taking some of the traditional approaches of traversing very complex and latent IP networks. So there's a couple things there that, from a trend perspective, I see. The other part of the equation I see too is that people in the past have viewed backup and recovery architectures as sort of a sunk cost, certainly from a TCO perspective, where you're trying to get that TCO as low as possible. Now I see that definitely shifting, and I know we'll have like a little bit of a section later in here around copy data management, but there's definitely a growing trend in terms of how can I get more out of my secondary storage, and I think that's where some of this alignment is happening, where they see the possibility of some greater efficiency in secondary storage and then actually being able to apply an ROI to it for the first time in a long time, where you can actually use it for stuff as opposed to, my example is always like, I don't like to pay my life insurance bill ever, because I'm never going to derive any utility from it. My wife might, but but now I think what you're seeing is from an insurance perspective, you can actually use that to your advantage. So with some new techniques.
So I would agree with that sentiment of want to do different, want to do better. I would argue it's almost want to do smarter. Right? That idea of, could we please just stop repeating the recipe that we have before and rethink what do we need to do in a way that's outcome driven as opposed to just looking for a better mousetrap per se along the way. So when organizations are looking for some of that along the way, that often drives that consideration for change, right? So that's what you've kind of queued us up for in this case. So, so factors that would drive organizations to change their primary backup solution to a new vendor or to a new solution. And again, I like the fact that you see some very common sentiment here. Again, number one, by a long shot, just improve the reliability. Right, that goes back to that 3 out of 10 backup windows, that 2 out of 3 on meeting your SLAs, all those squeaky wheel, the superlatives and the qualitatives between the execs and the implementers that finally line up, just solve reliability, right? Now then past that, all right, so certainly you can't have a conversation without cloud. We're going to talk about where cloud fits in the modern data protection strategy in just a few slides, but number 2, very quickly behind it, yes, being able to move into cloud-based data protection is part of the solution. The idea of consolidation, right? So, so certainly we see a couple things that are still kind of in the mix. We see that idea of workload admins like vAdmins and DBAs who want to do their own thing. We also see, though, that pressure of, if I've got something that works for me, where else can I leverage it in a way that's still disruptive and still leverages best-of-breed type technologies along the way, right? So, and I think that's one of the things that we saw, just kind of giving a nod to the host. Veeam started off certainly in that virtualization only space, but over the last year or so, 2 years, I guess, they've added agents for physical. They've announced for agents for IaaS, SaaS. So that idea of, okay, so you've got this thing that protects most of you. How about we add in those last remnants and drive consolidation again? So I think it's interesting where those top 3 go. Yes, cost comes in the top 5, but I think it's Patrick, I got to tell you, I'm happy that improving TCO is not the number one thing. Number one thing is it's got to work better, right? Number 2, yeah, cloud should be part of it. Number 3, I want some operational benefit. And then we can talk about cost. Once you fix the problems, then we can start assessing whether cost matters or not. So,
Absolutely.
All right. And that's going to cue us up for the idea of a better together story, right? So, so you want to kind of take us through why did Hewlett Packard Enterprise partner with Veeam? Tell me about that story for a second. I can click forward if you like.
Yeah, that would be great if you could click forward. So one of the reasons why we chose to partner with Veeam for helping customers with some of their most challenging data protection and availability problems in the certainly in the virtualization space was that we saw a growing trend of customers that are using both of these solutions together in the same ecosystem. So Veeam has been on fire from a growth rate perspective. We've got almost 14 million VMs protected in 200 plus countries, and if you take a look at some of the stats around the proliferation of virtualized workloads, I mean they're certainly protecting a good portion of that from a global basis. And more Veeam runs on HPE infrastructure than any other portfolio or infrastructure provider in the market. And if you take a look at that leadership position from HPE, we're the #1 global leader in server virtualization solutions with VMware. We've got 500,000 customers out there or more on everything from Synergy and the ProLiant platforms to our converged systems and hyper-converged systems. If you take a look at the position in the market, HPE is #1 in servers, #2 in storage. So we've got a pretty big intersection with some of the most challenging and some of the most scalable virtualized workloads. So if you could move to the next slide, Jason.
Sure.
So a couple of the things that we see is not only just customers choosing to put those two ecosystems together, but from a strategic perspective, it's something that fits along the lines of what we see around data protection and availability. So from us, from the HPE perspective, we have sort of a vision around what we want to deliver for our customers, and it has 5 tenets. What we want to provide is application-centric protection and availability, so that you can be doing a number of these availability and protection operations from within your app, whether you're doing it through VMware or through Oracle or SQL or a number of different facilities. You don't have to break context, and a lot of the things around RTO and RPO and SLAs are translated right to your application perspective. I want to provide a number of use cases, so whether that's just taking applications consistent snapshots for local rollback, or you want to be doing deep archiving, we want to support all those. Certainly an outcomes-based approach from a strategy perspective, now that RTO and RPO is getting much more granular, much more aggressive, and really has a big impact on the organization. We want to be able to provide federated platforms. So when we talk about that, I think the days of customers buying along the lines of horizontal lines. So I'm going to choose a server vendor, I'm going to choose a networking vendor, I'm going to choose a primary storage vendor. We're starting to see more of a vertically oriented approach, which is I'm going to put together a stack. I want that stack to work together from application to compute and memory to networking to primary storage to secondary storage and beyond. So we want to have federated platforms. And cloud is a huge part of the equation. So we want to be cloud ready in terms of that's a big workload for secondary storage that people are choosing to move to the cloud or want to have options to move to the cloud, especially for deep archiving. So when we take a look at this strategy from HPE, if you go to the next slide, Jason, it really matched up nicely with what Veeam is constantly talking about in the market, right? So any infrastructure, on-premises, SaaS offerings, a big presence in the service provider community with tons of options around cloud. And this Veeam Ability platform, when combined with what we provide from HPE on the compute, storage, networking, and hyperconverged front, really fits together nicely. And what we've been able to do is take that and make a number of integrations for our customers. So if you go to the next slide, Jason. So what we do is we have a number of integrations and use cases that we support for our customers, and they could be in the data center. So we've got a number of things that we do with either SimpliVity and Nimble and 3PAR, as well as Store Virtual, integrating with Veeam and Store Once. We have a lot of customers with smaller remote offices that allow us to protect those remote offices. We have a number of customers that are doing DR traditionally, where you have your own data center. We have a set of customers that are certainly partnering with some of our service provider partners to extend DR capabilities between those service providers, or going to the tier 1 public cloud. And then we see a huge area around secondary storage and long-term archival, whether that's out to some more traditional architectures like tape, or to things like object storage and cloud object storage. Certainly a bunch of areas here, but this is all co-engineered, tested, and things that we deliver now as use cases for our customers. So we have a ton of integration points from a solution perspective. Next slide, Jason. So if you take a look at just some basic capabilities around meat and potatoes data protection. I mean, one of the things that we always go back to is this 3-2-1 rule, and that's the ability to provide a number of different facets of data protection with our combined solution. So if you could click through this, Jason, that'd be great.
Sure.
So first of all, you've got the 1 rule, right, which is you have to have 3 copies of your you have to have copies of your data out here, and it should be on 3 copies at the very least, right? So what we see is a number of capabilities of the ability to take snapshots with our primary storage integrated with Veeam, and those copies sit on your primary storage, and then we have the ability to evacuate those over our very low bandwidth replication protocol we call Catalyst, to what we call a product called Store Once, which is a purpose-built backup appliance. And then you can archive that off to tape or to the cloud and object storage. That gives you the ability to have it on 2 different types of media, and then ultimately having one of those off-site. I can't tell you how many customers I've talked to that there's a very simple rule that don't apply this to their architecture. I don't know, Jason, if you have any stories or anecdotes on this. I see it all the time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it seems like such a simple thing that you need multiple copies of your data, multiple versions. Those copies need to be survivable, right? So we've all heard of the guy who their primary copy of data was in data center 1, and they solved for availability, right? If the server went down, it picked back up in seconds. Well, the reason it picked it back up in seconds is because the second server with the second copy was right next to it. Or maybe it was across the highway or across the aisle. And guess what? When you have a weather problem, when you have a network outage, you have a power outage, for all these kinds of reasons, if you have all of your copies within the same, let's call it, zone of impact or influence, then all of your copies are as offline. Certainly the idea of multiple different types of media and then having a copy off-site. And I would tell you that a copy off-site should not only be off-site, but also let's call it with what we call an air gap, meaning that you do not want your data protection engine or anything else to be able to have ubiquitous access to all of the copies. And the reason for that is looking at some of the malware considerations that we've seen recently. Some of those malware solutions are actually smart enough to go after your backups copies, right? So having something where you have copies that are off-site, having copies that have an air gap along the way, that are in multiple zones of impact so that you can actually recover when you need to. This is all foundational. So.
Yep, and I would say that before we finish this section up and move into section 3, I would say I've seen a number of customers lately who implemented an all-flash array in the last, let's say, 12 to 18 months. And what you see is on the left-hand side where you see databases, apps, files, data, VMs, what we mentioned before is that the packing ratio for those applications and that data on one piece of physical infrastructure is increasing because of flash, and you're allowed to do that. I've seen a lot of customers who deploy that one flash array without this 3-2-1 rule, and maybe just are doing old traditional backup to tape, for example. And something happens and things do. Hardware breaks, software breaks, and you're not architected to be able to withstand that and have a good RPO and sane RTO. We're talking days and days of recovery. So I've seen it, and it's something that worries me all the time. So we're always out pitching this type of solution. So I don't know, Jason, if we want to talk a little bit more about, move on to the next section around how we can make better use of some of the secondary storage?
Absolutely. So we've modernized production, we've modernized protection. Now we're going to talk about how to do more with that. So we talk about some of the agility that that folks are looking for. You know, it is important to, and I know you touched on this a little bit with when you mentioned 3PAR and RMC, but backup alone is not enough, right? So when you look at the kinds of recoveries that folks have to do, when you look at the level of agility that you need, almost any scenario where you have to, you know, diagnose, determine, and then click a restore button and then wait, right? On almost any of that math, it becomes unpalatable pretty quickly. In fact, when we look at, you know, some people call it mission critical or business critical or high priority, you know, if you get rid of all the subjective terms and just say, what percentage of your servers have each of the following SLAs? You know, we found that in general, right around a third, 35% of servers have a downtime tolerance of about 15 minutes or less. And just, you know, going all the way back to that first HP statistic, which came from the ESG report that we did for Veeam last year, earlier this year, excuse me, that availability gap. If you have servers that have a 15-minute or less recovery window, and you don't have a technology that enables that 15-minute or less recovery window, you have an availability gap, right? That is the simple math on that. Another third of servers was at 32% have an SLA between 15 minutes and up to 2 hours. And then you can see it kind of builds out from there. But my point is that if the only thing you're trying to do is backup, you're not going to meet these windows. So the way ESG talks about this, we talk about it as really having a spectrum-based approach to data protection, where you are complementing backups. Those are in orange, and that's the foundation of any data protection strategy. But you are complementing your backups with snapshots, because that's going to be much more agile coming from production storage. Replication, that's going to give you survivability and another level of agility from a recovery perspective. Veeam likes to talk about availability a lot, and so that idea, but we talk about it in a much, you know, even in a broader sense than that, around not just the reactive side of things, but the proactive side of durable IT as well. Also talked about archiving. So there's a lot of different combinations that kind of come into how do you actually ensure the level of agility that you need. Now, this all sounds great. In fact, just since virtualization is the secret sauce we talked about earlier, I will tell you, we asked folks that are protecting VMware in blue and then Hyper-V in gold environments, what else are you doing to protect your VMs? Now, there's a lot of buzzwords here around snapshots from storage, from the hypervisor and replication, et cetera. Here's what I want you to look at. Look at the bottom. The very smallest statistic that you see, 11% of VMware environments, 1 out of 9, same 1 out of 9 for Hyper-V environments as well, responded, we do not use any other approaches than VM backups. So if 1 out of 9 folks are only rely on VM backups, then 8 out of 9 environments are supplementing their VM backups with something, snapshots, replication, something else along that way. And that's great. You're getting the agility that you need, but the problem is you got extra copies. You got a lot of extra copies, right? So when you start looking at all the copies that are out there, and I think the math on this we figured out is about 10.7 copies between dailies, weeklies, monthlies, incrementals, differentials, fulls, snaps, replicas, BCDR copies. All of them make sense until you add them up, right? And that's one of the reasons why cost continues to be something that implementers struggle with. And that's going to introduce us to this idea of copy data management, and that idea of, okay, so what else can I do with this data, right? So we asked folks, what are the most compelling parts about a copy data management type architecture? Certainly just reducing the storage footprint is a big part of it. Consolidation of the tool set becomes compelling as well, and you can kind of start to see this through. Let me get rid of the tech for just a second and just kind of offer you what I think copy data management really ought to look like when you're having this conversation. Because different vendors call it different things, right? In my mind, copy data management really comes down to it's the difference between budget and lifestyle. You know, in my personal life, I would like to go out to eat every night. I would like to have a new car every other year. And I would like to have a house that's big enough that there might be rooms I don't actually have chock full of junk, I can't afford that, right? That same kind of, and in the real world, what that means is I either have to not go out to eat so often, I not have quite as big a house, not as shiny a car, or I got to work a second job. Right? That's the reality on that trade-off. I would tell you that in IT, it's a similar math. I need copies for backups. I need copies for snapshots and for replication and BCDR. And by the way, the DevOps folks want some, and the testing and operations folks, they want some. It all sound like good things. I just can't afford that many copies. And so in copy data management, I either need to reduce the number of copies, but I can't do that because I need all the copies I got, and frankly, I need more copies than I'm making right now, or at least access to that data. Or I got to unlock incremental business value that pays for the infrastructure that I already know that I want and need. And so, so the whole idea of copy data management is what can you do to unlock the value of this otherwise dormant data by making it more harnessable than put a second copy in a box and break glass in case of emergency. So Patrick, can you talk to us about how does the Veeam and HPE combination, how does that unlock some of these outcomes?
Yeah, so if you take, I really like the business description that you went through, Jason. And what we're being allowed to do now because of the technology is have those business discussions around how to do more with less and make more efficient use of your secondary storage. And what we do is for some of our infrastructure, for example, when we federate our platforms like 3PAR and StoreOnce, each one of those has some unique capabilities that allow us to do this essentially copy data management. So in the past, when you'd have an array and snapshots, most people didn't actually run test dev and user acceptance testing and a number of things like spinning up test databases on the same physical infrastructure because the properties of those arrays from a performance perspective wouldn't allow it. But now that we have infrastructure like 3PAR, which is going to provide you flash, extreme performance, things like quality of service and multi-tenancy, we can actually take those concepts, and with technology that we call Recovery Manager Central, we can take applications and essentially provide test dev copies of them. So a lot of things that are being enabled by the operating system and the capabilities of 3PAR, and certainly because of some of the properties from a performance perspective for Flash, is allowing us to take copies of that data and make it useful, as well as we're also integrating those capabilities with Veeam to be able to do very granular application item restores and other things that you can do from an application standpoint. So with this technology that we have, which is called RMC, and our integration with not only the platforms but also with Veeam, allows us to do some of this copy data managed capability really well, and it also allows you to do this without impacting your production environment. So you can take copies in that world of a shrinking or zero backup window. Being able to do this backup or these copies without impacting the performance is super important. Whereas you don't have to point a media server and do long-running scans of data and really impact your performance capabilities. So if you move to the next slide, Jason. The other thing that we're seeing as well too is because of some of the cost capabilities of Flash, we're seeing this rise of what we call secondary Flash. So when you take a look at some of the architectures that we have in systems like Nimble, right, you can have a hybrid Flash array that has always-on dedupe and compression. So that's really going to optimize your usable dollars per gigabyte from a storage perspective. But since it is a hybrid primary storage array, you get essentially the performance that you would need to run a number of secondary applications. So it's optimized for secondary workloads and copy data management, but it's at a price an efficiency standpoint, where essentially it's about 50% of the price of what you get from an all-flash array. So the performance allows you to run workloads on these architectures, and with dedupe and compression and some of the dedupe and compaction rates we get for virtual machines running with Veeam and Nimble on secondary flash, it's going to hit a price point that makes it worth it. So we're also introducing new architectures for Flash that hit certain price points, so you can actually do stuff with your backup data. And in the case of copy data management, this Nimble storage secondary flash array puts your backup data at work on a primary array that's cheap enough to use as secondary storage. Kind of neat.
Kind of neat. That's a technical term, right? Okay.
Yeah, it's very super technical.
Awesome. All right, so I build this out for you on Flash?
Yes, please. So what this results in is essentially you have some new tools in your quiver, right, to go attack some of these data protection problems, right? We talked about the ability to put your backup data at work with some new architectures like secondary flash array, completely integrated with Veeam and Veeam snapshot capability, so you can run instant VM recovery, you can run backup verification, you can do some of the sandboxing capabilities and run that on a performance on a secondary system that has good enough performance and hits the right price, or for customers that are looking to back up at scale and provide the sort of the lowest cost that you can to provide a broad range of backup options for application systems, all different types of arrays. You can start with store once and some of the capabilities we have for copy data management with RMC. So lots of opportunities there to take some of these tools now that are new around copy data management and secondary storage to be able to put that backup data to work. So Jason, you can skip the next slide and move to the next section.
Fair enough. All right, so let's kind of plan for the last piece of this, and again, I think what we're trying to talk about here is just the fact that all of the things we talked about, Flash, around better data protection, certainly Pat, what you mentioned around integrating the primary storage and secondary storage and tertiary storage even with your data protection movers. Right, all of that, it basically comes down to that fact of better togetherness, and I would offer to you, and hybrid is a fuzzy word, but the idea of it's not or, it's and, right? I mean, that's really kind of the driving force. I did a blog post on it not that long ago on data protection should be hybrid everywhere from a means and mechanisms perspective. When we look at what's driving IT spending as a strategy, not just in data protection or storage, but lift that up one more level. You look at what the CIO is thinking about when they're deciding whether to spend or not spend. Certainly, cybersecurity tops most of our lists. We have a long list of large companies to thank for those invasions, but right behind that, and number 2 is cost reduction. Certainly, regulatory compliance comes always in the top 4 or 5. For those folks that are listening from Europe, GDPR is right around the corner, so enjoy that. And then even just a few notches down, business continuity, disaster recovery, that idea of enabling availability, which of course then enables the digital transformations that we talked about earlier. All right, but if we focus on costs, we're looking at business initiatives, so let's focus on the cost factor. We asked folks, how are you planning on reducing costs? I think there's really kind of 2 bands, and this comes back to what we talked about earlier as well, that idea of doing IT smarter. Right, so the actual answer is number 1, renegotiate contracts. I think we would all agree it would be nice to do what you've always been doing, but pay less for it. Okay, for you. So certainly IT outsourcing comes in as part of that as well. How do you address labor costs and expertise to get better competency? But then right behind that, running at those top 4, tied for 3rd, increasing use of cloud services. Right, and then along that lines, purchasing new technology that has better ROI. And here's a spoiler alert: one of the ways that many of those new technologies are delivering better ROI is by using the cloud. Right, and so that's what's driving cloud as part of many different data protection strategies. Now let's double click one more time And we asked folks, how are you planning on using cloud in 2017? And guess what? Number one use case, I think third, fourth year in a row, something like that, has a repository for backup and archival data, right? Get your data out of the building and do it cheaper while you're at it. Also in the number 3 spot, just 2 percentage points behind, disaster recovery. Certainly, I think running production applications, especially when you look at SaaS-based applications like Office 365 and Salesforce, it's easy to see how those address durability in their own way, and yet, especially in the case of Office 365, there's still a need to protect that data. And I give a nod to Veeam as they've announced some support for that as well. But using the cloud, the first and third use cases are around data protection. In fact, arguably that fourth use case around test and dev comes back to, Pat, what you and I talked about earlier on how do we get more value out of that data? Well, part of that is making it warm instead of cold so that I can actually do something with that. So that's where you see where cloud's coming in the picture. And yet, let's be very, very clear, cloud is not necessarily a tape killer, and it's certainly not a disk killer. There is a reason to use each of those medium types as part of a holistic data protection strategy. That also comes down to the 3-2-1 rule that Patrick talked about earlier. So we asked, this is kind of an eye chart, so don't try to read all of it, but the point is that we asked folks, what's your primary data backup medium today? And a lot are disk. 3/4 of organizations use disk as their first means of recovery, and frankly, that should only go up, especially when you start counting snapshots and replicas and not just backups. But then, even though 3/4 of folks use disk, and that's continuing to increase as their first means of recovery, the tertiary copy sometimes is disk, often is tape, sometimes is cloud along the way. We ask that question actually about every year or so, every other year. And so we've been tracking that answer over time. Now, again, this is, we looked at the data in 2012, 15, 17. Then we asked people in 17, what are you going to do in 19? Kind of gives us some nice data. Just thinking about that approach for hybrid media, using each medium and mechanism for what it's best at. Let me just kind of tear this down as something which we can actually nerd out on for just a minute. Over the last 7 years, as much as people like to say, tape is dead, tape is dead, tape is not dead. Tape consumption's gone down from 56% of folks using it as part of their backup solution in 2012. It's only dropped 13 points down to 43%, still roughly half of organizations using tape as part of their data protection strategy moving forward. Meanwhile, cloud has gone up, actually by almost the same percentage along the way, but it's not because necessarily that, that they are replacing tape with cloud. It's because cloud enables certain kinds of agility that otherwise you can't do from a cold cartridge. But my point here, I hope that you see, is there is a place for all three kinds of medium, because each of them provides a different level of recoverability than what the other two might provide. Patrick, you want to kind of wrap this up again with taking us through the HP story on CloudBank?
Yeah, I mean, so just a quick mention on the tape. So tape is certainly not dead. We actually, I think, shipped more raw capacity for tape last year than any year previously, and it continues to increase. So it's still, from a cost perspective, the most cost-effective piece from a media perspective. I think the knock on that is that as customers move away from dedicated backup teams, it does represent a fixed cost for people that have to manage tape environments. And so what we see here is for partnering with Veeam and within HPE to provide customers, especially smaller to medium-sized customers who don't necessarily have the ability to take on that OpEx cost of managing a large tape environment or the cost of having a secondary data center, and understanding we need to get a long-term archival strategy in place, or even have an off-site center for that that third copy of your data. What we introduced within StoreOnce is the ability to use an on-prem or off-prem public object storage service. So this can really decrease your cost of storing your backups on disk. If you combine some of the things we do around deduplication and compression with the cost of some of these object storage services on a per month basis, you have the ability to have access to long-term archival of data protection and copies off-premises in the cloud. And what we also see is for customers that have really large scale in the enterprise, moving towards an on-premises object store that's going to give you sort of a limitless pool of storage at a much lower operating expense is a trend that we see increasing as people use object storage as a ubiquitous archiving tier or tier 3, tier 4 storage offering within their data center. So a lot of things we're doing, but cloud is definitely here. We're providing some capabilities for customers to take advantage of this architecture for not only from a cost perspective for the media itself, but also to help drive down costs from an OpEx perspective.
All right, and that's going to kind of bring us right back to kind of reminding about that 3-2-1 rule we talked about earlier. Using cloud as part of it, tape is part of it. Disk is going to be your first-year recovery. Arguably, your first-year recovery should be snapshot-based, and then we're behind that disk-based backup, and then you can kind of start to argue about where the different mediums start to come in, the multi-sites, et cetera. All right, and that's going to kind of wrap us up. We got about 2 minutes left. If you haven't taken a screenshot yet, these are kind of the 4 trends that between Hewlett Packard Enterprise and the Enterprise Strategy Group that we're advocating for organizations of all sizes. Turns out our friends in the green shirts over at Veeam have some of the secret sauce that makes a lot of this kind of work out. So with that, we're going to kind of open it up for Q&A. If you have questions about how the joint solutions all work together, feel free to visit our hosts, veeam.com/HPE-availability-solution. .html. That just kind of rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our hosts, and if there's any Q&A for us to cover, otherwise, I think we'll give you a minute back in your day. Roxana, you want to bring us home? I think that's a no. All right. Well.
All right. Well, Jason, it was great speaking with you. Thanks for everyone for joining the webinar. We'll make the slides available for everyone via email, and I think we'll have a recorded copy of this for folks that want access to the recording. And if any of you guys or ladies out there have questions about some of the technologies or things we talked about, you can find Jason and I on Twitter and LinkedIn. We'd be happy to engage.
Before we go, Patrick and Jason, can you hear me? This is Travis.
Yep.
Oh, fantastic. So first of all, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of the attendees who joined. Number one, we hope that this was of value. I've got to tell you, guys, this was, from my perspective, tremendous. I mean, it shows, it gives our customers and partners and everyone really who has availability on the mind, which everybody does, sort of a plan and path forward that they can take immediately into their organizations. So thank you very much, Patrick and Jason. We appreciate the partnership with both of you. And if there's nothing else, we bid everyone adieu. Have a great weekend. Signing off now. Thank you.
Well, have a great day. Thanks again.